is everyone?
Good.
Good evening again. It's a great pleasure to welcome you to our show tonight. It's again our Ambassadors Forum, and thank you very much for coming. I'm very pleased to observe that so many of you have found their way to our Ambassadors Forum, and it's pretty great to see that the room is so full that such a good crowd has arrived. I'm Klaus Lars, and I'm the Richard M. Krasno Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs here at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Once again, I would like to welcome you, students, faculty, UNC administrators, and not least the many members of the general public here in the Triangle area. And of course, I'd like to welcome Ambassador Jack Matlock, and I would like to extend a special welcome to Ambassador Matlock's wife, Rebecca. Thanks for coming. As you know, we are videotaping today's event. We have a YouTube channel, youtube.com/KrasnoUNC, and you will be able to see this event today in a week's time, I would say. There are many other exciting events to be watched on that channel. Please watch it as often as you possibly can, and please subscribe to it. It's all totally free. I would also like to welcome my colleague, Professor Don Rowley, who is the J. Richard Judson Distinguished Professor of History here at UNC. Professor Rowley is one of our outstanding scholars of Russia and the former Soviet Union, with many publications to his name. He will join me on stage later on to interrogate the ambassador about his distinguished career and his knowledge of Russian-American relations. Ambassador Matlock sent me an email a few days ago when he was visiting Berlin and said that he had just come back from a party with former Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev. This sounded like a great party. I think we all want to know what that party was like, which celebrated the 25th anniversary of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Ambassador Jack Matlock is actually a native boy. He was born and raised in Greensboro, North Carolina. Unfortunately, however, he went to Duke for some strange reason, rather than to UNC. However, I think we are prepared to forgive him for this serious faux pas. And he told me in confidence his brother went to UNC. Ambassador Matlock has had a long and distinguished career. Most of his 35-year career took place when the Cold War was at its height and when the Cold War was at its most dangerous. Jack Matlock's first assignment to Moscow was in 1961, and it was from the embassy there that he experienced the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis. He helped to translate diplomatic messages between Khrushchev and J.F. Kennedy. The next year, he was posted to West Africa, and a year later, he served in East Africa during the post-colonial period of superpower rivalry. In the early 1970s, during Henry Kissinger's reign in Washington, and at the beginning of détente with the Soviet Union, Jack was Director of Soviet Affairs in the State Department. He participated in all but one of the summit meetings between the American and Soviet leaders between 1972 and 1991. Between 1974 and 1978, Jack Matlock served as Deputy Ambassador in the American Embassy in Moscow, and in 1981 he again was sent to Moscow as Acting Ambassador. Soon afterwards, President Reagan appointed him Ambassador to Czechoslovakia, and after the breakup of that country, and I'm not sure that if that has got anything to do with the ambassador himself, and afterwards, in 1983, Reagan asked him to return to Washington to work at the National Security Council. He had the assignment to develop a negotiating strategy to end the arms race between Washington and Moscow. Then, in 1987, Jack Matlock was appointed ambassador to the Soviet Union. At the time, this was, of course, America's most important and most distinguished foreign service position. He remained in Moscow until 1991. In that year, 1991, when the Cold War ended and the Soviet Union disappeared, Jack Matlock felt he could now retire from the foreign service. His job had been well done. Since the early 1990s, Ambassador Matlock has been a faculty member at the Institute of Advanced Study at Princeton University. And apart from teaching and writing his memoirs on his time as ambassador and many other publications and opinion pieces, as we heard, he also still finds the time to attend exciting parties with Gorbachev and others in Berlin. And just recently, actually an hour ago, Jack Matlock told me that he started his PhD in 1953 at Columbia University, and he finished it last year in 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. 2000. all our students in the room, there is hope yet. Yes. So Dr. Matlock, well done, I must say. Ambassador Matlock, it's a great pleasure to have you here today. In a minute, the ambassador will talk to us about from Gorbachev to Putin, Russia and the United States in the post-Cold War world. Afterwards, Don Rawley and I will pepper him a little with most challenging questions, of course. And then we have plenty of time for questions from you, the audience. And after that, I think there's also plenty of time to mingle a little bit and perhaps talk to the ambassador and his wife in private. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my distinct pleasure and honor to present to you Ambassador Jack F. Matlock. Please join me in a warm welcome.
Thank you very much for those kind words. I hope this mic is working properly positioned to be audible. It's really a delight to be here. And as I say, as a native North Carolinian, even though I went to Duke, I always cheer for Carolina as long as you're not playing Duke. At least I maintain that much loyalty to my native state. And by the way, if any of you who are PhD candidates in the room, don't take 60 years to write your dissertation. It probably won't work anymore. So what advice I have to give may be based on some of my own failings, which I hope are not always repeated. This evening, I was asked to talk about what's happened to U.S.-Russian relations since the end of the Cold War, and I want to leave most of the time for the discussion of the issues that interest you most. So let me simply go in rather quick fashion over what I think some of the most important things to remember and to think about when we think about today. There's all sorts of talk today about Cold War II. About the confrontation, particularly over Ukraine, is having echoes of the Cold War. And indeed, the rhetoric sounds very similar. It sounds similar, and even Mikhail Gorbachev, when he was in Berlin last weekend, warned that we may be on the brink of a new Cold War. Let me say right up front, I think that is an exaggeration. I think it is probably not accurate to compare at least the magnitude in its implications of what is happening today with what happened during the Cold War. After all, during the Cold War, we had a worldwide confrontation, and a confrontation that fundamentally was based on a very different philosophy. What we have today between Russia and NATO, Russia and the United States, is a confrontation over events in an area which during the Cold War would have been internal to the Soviet Union. Also, there is no basic difference in philosophy. Russia is a capitalist country now, authoritarian capitalist, not democratic, but capitalist, not communist, nor are they trying to spread a philosophy or a particular type of government throughout the world, which had been the case of the Soviet Union from its inception, up until Mikhail Gorbachev revised the philosophy. So that doesn't mean that what we are experiencing today is good, or is trivial, or is not dangerous. But it does, I think, exaggerate things a bit to compare it to the Cold War, which I think was much more dangerous. At least yet, we don't have a nuclear arms race. In fact, I don't think we have anything like an arms race of the one that did occur during the Cold War. And let's hope that neither side is stupid enough to make it that. So yes, the confrontations today are serious, and there are implications with things like military maneuvers, which normally you wouldn't need to worry about, except that if there is an accident, say one of these Russian planes that are flying without a transponder on gets in the route of a passenger airliner. There can be accidents, and these can be very serious, and they even could be escalated. Although, frankly, I think our leaders have learned enough now that even if there is an incident, they're going to be careful not to escalate it. Because even though we don't worry much about nuclear weapons, the fact is both the United States and Russia still have enough to destroy each other if they're ever used. And that's something that I think none of our leaders forget when they're dealing with this. Now, I think to understand the current situation, we need to go back and think a bit about how did we end the Cold War? And do most of our people understand that, or do they have mistaken image, a mistaken understanding about at least some aspects of it? I think that there are very widespread misunderstandings of what happened during the Cold War, both here as well as in Russia and Western Europe, for that matter in Asia perhaps too, but it's most relevant what happens in Europe and Russia and the United States. And that is, first of all, how many people have in mind that the Cold War ended when the Soviet Union collapsed? Not very many, it seems. Well, you're very well informed, because, you know, there was a movie on the Cold War, several parts, broadcast by CNN maybe 10 years ago or so, which ends precisely with the Russian flag going up over the Kremlin after the hammer and sickle red flag came down. And when I saw in advance of that and was talking to the producer, I said, look, the Cold War was over 3 years before the Soviet Union came down. Why are you making that the end of the Cold War? And he said, well, you know, that's dramatic. Is this drama, or is this supposed to be history? Fact is, the Cold War ended, in my opinion, at least 3 years before the Soviet Union collapsed. And the reason it's important to understand this is that if you think of the Cold War as anything like a real war, one that has victors and one that has losers, then obviously we survived as a state, as a country, and whereas the Soviet Union fell apart. That means we won, doesn't it? Well, sure. I mean, it ended to our advantage, but the fact is, when the Cold War ended, it was also to the advantage of the Soviet Union. Every agreement we made with the Soviet Union was in its interest as well as ours. And we had defined an agenda with that in mind. And the fact is, we ended the Cold War by agreement. Neither side was a victory over the other. Another misconception is that we did it with military and economic pressure. You know, when President Reagan died, the British journal, The Economist, had a cover, and it was "A Man Who Conquered Communism." It's not right. It wasn't Ronald Reagan that conquered communism. It was Mikhail Gorbachev. We can talk about that a bit if you want, but the fact is that when we ended the Cold War, and philosophically the Cold War was over by December 1988, then it freed up Gorbachev to try to liberalize the Soviet Union, to try to open it up. He couldn't have done that if the Cold War had continued. And when the party apparatus began to be opposed to the changes, he was one of these rare leaders that put the interests of the country before the interests of the party and even the interest of his own position. He systematically took the Communist Party out of, and the instruments of repression out of control of the country. partly by using elections and other techniques that we generally considered part of the democratic process. So, to start with, as far as ending the Cold War, it was done cooperatively between Presidents Reagan and the first President Bush and Mikhail Gorbachev. Took them both. It was not a victory of one over the other. Second, in removing the Communist Party from power in the Soviet Union, Gorbachev took away the instruments of repression so that subsequently, when the internal pressures of the Soviet Union began to be felt, there was no way to contain them. The Soviet Union came apart not because of Western pressure and not as a Western victory, but because of internal pressures which were let loose as a result of the fact that we ended the Cold War, we had ended the arms race, we had ended the external pressure on that system. And did we want that to happen? No. Actually, it was U.S. policy to try to help Gorbachev keep a voluntary federation of all of the republics except the 3 Baltic countries, which we had never considered legally part of the Soviet Union. We wanted them to go independent. We hoped that the rest would stay in some sort of union. President Bush, the elder, made a speech in Kiev August 1st, 1991, when he advised the Ukrainians and the other non-Baltic republics to adhere to Gorbachev's Union Treaty. And he said explicitly, freedom and independence are not synonymous. Choose freedom. He also warned, beware of suicidal nationalism. Now, he didn't have Ukraine in mind at that time, he had Georgia in mind. Because the Gamsakhurdia, then the leader in Georgia, was already attacking that little enclave called South Ossetia, one that has been a problem ever since. Now, the reason I make these points is that when then he faced an election campaign that he knew was going to have trouble winning, and in fact he didn't win. In 1992, President Bush actually started making a speech saying, "We won the Cold War." This was something that Mikhail Gorbachev mentioned in Berlin in his speech just last weekend. It was like a dagger. Of course, he had already been removed, but the idea that we were victors, then this leaves the idea in Russia, okay, you either fooled him or he was incompetent, and so on. But to make it worse, we began to treat Russia as if it were a defeated country. Another concept that I think we get wrong and still do, this whole idea of superpower. What's a superpower? You know, we began to talk later, there were 2 superpowers, US and the Soviet Union. And then when the Soviet Union collapsed, there was only one superpower. You can do anything, can't you, if you really want to. That was never the case. Yes, each of the superpowers could have destroyed not only each other, but the whole world with its weapons. What else can you do with them? There is no rational military use for nuclear weapons or other weapons of mass destruction. The only reason you have them is to keep somebody from using them against you. So, does that make you a superpower? Well, if it does, US and Russia are still superpowers, because we still have enough that we can destroy each other and in the process everybody else. Does it help you solve other people's problems? No. In fact, as President Obama has said several times recently, and I think very wisely, you can have the best military in the world, but many of the problems in the world can't be solved by military means. As the old saw goes, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. But you need other things. And you often need different methods. And one thing that we have demonstrated time and time again is you cannot create a functional democratic government in another country by military occupation. You can't. There was a time when people said, well, look what happened to Germany and Japan after World War II. In both cases, the Germans and the Japanese created their forms of democracy. We didn't do it for them. I mean, they were defeated, and I think we were right in some of our decisions, such as, for example, the decision to retain the Japanese emperor. But the fact is, in both of those countries who have quite different forms of democracy today, they did it. And that's really true of every country. And yet, somehow we came out with the idea, well, we'd won the Cold War, and now we're living in what some started to call a unipolar world. And if people have problems, well, either we can solve them or we can refuse to solve them. And if you don't solve them, you're damned if you do, and you're damned if you don't. But in this process, we systematically began to treat Russia as if it were a defeated power. And the things that they mention most often are the way NATO was expanded to the east, and there are a lot of details to that we can talk about. I'll just say that as we were ending the Cold War and the division of Europe, we certainly not only insinuated, but at times told Gorbachev, not only the Americans, but the Germans, the British, the French, that there would be no expansion of NATO to the east if they would allow Germany to unite and stay in NATO. Now, that was not a legal commitment, but it was certainly a moral commitment. Now, subsequent administrations followed a different policy. Even the first expansions of NATO probably would have been acceptable under certain circumstances. They couldn't stop them. But the next thing that the Russians noticed, that we were bombing Serbia, a clear act of war, when Serbia had not attacked any NATO member. Well, we thought we had good reasons for that, except that without a vote of the UN Security Council, which of course would have required a vote or an abstention by Russia and China, we could not legally do it. So yeah, I think today when we say, well, Russia has violated international law in taking Crimea, in interfering in eastern Ukraine, yes, they have. But we should recognize that we too did over time. And even more outrageous in their eyes was the invasion of Iraq, which also had not attacked us, and which at the time they and our close allies, France and Germany, vigorously opposed for reasons that I think now should be evident. That we certainly were not going to be able to create, a functioning democracy in that country by a military occupation. There were other things that were specific, I would say, to Russian interests. We pulled out of the ABM Treaty, the one that had been signed as far back as 1972 and had been sort of the basis of our strategic equality when we negotiated an end to the Cold War. This was done during the Bush-Cheney administration. And then we continued to expand NATO from the original members into the Baltic countries, into the Balkans also, and to talk of beginning to put bases there. And by the way, when they agreed that East Germany could join West Germany and stay in NATO, we agreed that there would be no foreign troops and no foreign bases there. That's an agreement, and it has been abided by. But that precedent for other NATO countries was never followed later. And the reason I point these things out is that increasingly they began to feel to the Russians that not only were we not paying any attention to their interests, but also that we were out really to surround them and to, in effect, to make them a virtual colony of a world in which the United States was the global hegemon. And things got particularly dicey when it came to former Soviet republics other than the Baltic states. Most of all Ukraine, which historically had been, most of it, had been part of Russia for centuries. Other parts had been added, but it had been put together essentially after World War II. And some of its borders were formed just by administrative fiat. The people were never consulted as to whether they wanted to be in Ukraine or into Russia or something else. There was a vote that they didn't want to be in the Soviet Union. This was said in '91. But on the other hand, so later I think this came really to affect the attitude not just of President Vladimir Putin, and one can say a lot more about his background, about his attitudes and those of others, but it is absolutely clear that in reestablishing a strongly authoritarian system, he has used what he considers the hostility of the United States in particular, but also Western Europe, and particularly the threat he sees from NATO as an excuse for what he does. And now that he has control of the media, he has used the confrontation over Ukraine to whip up support for himself in ways that I think are going to be very dangerous for Russia in the future, because we're getting a very virulent form of Russian nationalism. Putin's approval ratings were barely 50%, if that, before we had the occupation of Crimea and the reaction of the West to that. Now they are riding over 80%. And a lot of this is playing off what seemed to be, for a time, though this has diminished, almost a wrestling match between President Obama and President Putin, with each accusing the other in public of various things. I think President Obama's rhetoric now has been much quieter the last few weeks, but there was a time when it seemed he was almost daring, at least in Russian eyes, Putin to do what he has done. Meanwhile, we are now, in effect, stuck with extensive sanctions without any good prospect for an excuse to take them off, and they are going to be damaging to Russia, but they're apt to have two effects. One will be to convince the Russians that the negative effects of Putin's actions are actually caused by the US and Europe and the sanctions, which would not be true. And the other is that they are going to create an increasing tension between the United States and our European allies, because they have much more serious stakes in an economic relationship. Also, they are likely to weaken and perhaps even destroy some of the forces and groups within Russia that a democratic Russia is going to need the most. That is, a middle class, an entrepreneurial class. You bring down their financial system, and you are going to make future democracy, post-Putin democracy, much more difficult. So I think we are stuck today, and it's difficult to be optimistic that a way can be found because of the public positions both sides have taken. At the same time, I would have to say, go back, I don't think this is a new Cold War. I think it's going to have its dangerous edges, but the real losers right now, if this scenario is played out, is going to be Ukraine and Russia. The U.S., we don't really have that much of a stake there, other than one of humanitarian. And therefore, it does worry me a bit of how this is going to develop.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much. Now we will, as I promised, we will interrogate the ambassador a little bit with my colleague Professor Don Rowley and myself. And maybe, if I may, let me just ask the first question. You said that no one really won the Cold War. On the other hand, 2 years after what you said was the end of the Cold War in 88, 89, the Soviet Union disappeared. So isn't it pretty obvious that the US won the Cold War and the country which disappeared lost the Cold War? Is that wrong?
Well, I don't think so, because, well, when you put it that way, my point is, though, that the Cold War ended before that happened without either side being the victor. We carefully designed our negotiating strategy with the Soviet Union to be directed at changing the behavior of the Soviet Union, not to bring it down. That made what we wanted to do negotiable. Once we convinced the Soviet leaders that we were not going to attack them. One of the most important of the agreements was the one when President Reagan met Gorbachev the first time. This was in Geneva, November 1985, and they agreed on a statement, the following, very close paraphrase: a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought, which means there can be no war between us. And after that, as we negotiated on our regarding nuclear weapons and also conventional weapons, Secretary of State Schultz would go to Moscow and would show them charts of how both the US and the Soviet Union were putting enormous amounts of money into the military and had slowing growth rates. Whereas Germany and Japan at that time had very rapid growth rates and were spending less than 1% of their GDP on the military. And he would say, look, what are we doing, robbing our people for a war which is never going to be fought?
Yeah, that's that.
Oh. So, in other words, once we had established, look, we're not going to fight a war, and we know from records of the Politburo at that time, by 1987, Gorbachev was telling his military, we have got to cut. And when they would say, oh, we have to match this or we have to match that, Gorbachev would say, don't you get it? There is not going to be a war. Why are we doing this? So we actually brought the Cold War to an end, and the arms race to an end by appealing to the actual interests of the Soviet Union. Same thing true with the unification of Europe. This was not negotiated, but Gorbachev recognized that they had to let the Eastern Europeans make a choice in order for his own reforms to take hold in the Soviet Union. He had been very much, I would say, struck by the suppression of the Czechs, the Czechoslovaks, in 1968, when the Soviet Union invaded and cut off the Prague Spring. He had friends among some of the Czech Politburo, the liberals there, and one of the first things he did, by the way, after he was General Secretary, was rehabilitate Dubček. So I think he thought he was going to get reformed communists But he understood that they had an untenable situation in Eastern Europe. Now, most Soviet officials did not understand this, so he had to play a lot of maybe deceptive politics at home. But part of it was to take the Communist Party out of control of the country. Now, and one has to recognize that the Soviet Union that collapsed was not the pre-Gorbachev Soviet Union. It had changed profoundly. But the thing is, it was not brought down because they lost the Cold War. It was brought down because essentially they had an unreformable system. And the attempt to reform it brought it down, not the tensions of the Cold War. That's why I say, and you know, the thing is, by making that a victory in the Cold War, rather than, you might say, a matter of internal pressures, which in fact it was, makes it seem as if it was that it was actually Western desire to break up the Soviet Union. Obviously there were people in the West that did want to, but not the governments at that time, once Gorbachev started reforming. And also, if you look at it as a Cold War victory, then it makes it seem as if the resulting Russian Federation, which was not a party to the Cold War, was also defeated. And that's why I say we mustn't look at it that way. As a matter of fact, we would have considered it entirely consistent with our own interests and our foreign policy if Gorbachev had succeeded in keeping most of the Soviet republics in a voluntary federation, because it would have been a different country from the Soviet Union, and in some ways, if he could have pulled it off, it would have fewer problems than we have today.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ambassador Matlock, for joining us today. The problem with your comments is that I fully agree with them. That puts me sort of between a rock and a hard place, or a hammer and a sickle. Next time I leave, you're welcome to teach my course, because I would be very happy with you doing so. So I'm going to not interrogate you, but begin by pitching you a softball. The late George Kennan said that Washington rarely listens to its ambassadors. What was your experience?
I think George Kennan was right, but I was lucky. They did listen to me. And in part because I had worked in Washington in the White House before I came out. President Reagan and the National Security Advisor at the time had asked me in 1983 to design a negotiating strategy for the Soviet Union, and in cooperation with Secretary Shultz and others, and actually incorporating President Reagan's, I would say, his own instincts as to how to deal with people, we came up with the strategy, which did eventually bring it into the Cold War. So by the time he sent me as ambassador to Moscow, I was part of the policy-making team, which doesn't always happen. In fact, I might even say my experience is it rarely happens, unfortunately. And the second thing was that we had one absolutely first-class embassy. I mean, to say it's first-class doesn't do them justice. It was probably the most competent and active and best embassy we have ever assembled. I just had a terrific staff, and once the country began to open up, we knew virtually everybody. And Washington listened to us. And as I said, I think most ambassadors cannot say that as I can, and it was partly luck, it was partly the way the Reagan administration in particular handled its relationship. It was partly the fact that we had a president, particularly in Reagan, but also in the first Bush, who put his highest priorities in dealing with this. And I would say it also, I think, to get it away from anything personal, it was in the nature of both Reagan and Secretary of State Schultz to depend on staff to listen. Reagan in particular was a person who knew that there was a lot of stuff he didn't know. He was comfortable with that. He would ask to be educated. And somehow, once he liked the memos when I wrote for him, he would often note on them, "Thanks for explaining this, Jack. I didn't really fully understand it." So, you know, I really felt I could represent the Secretary of State and the President after having worked with them in Washington for over 3 years, that I could go to Moscow and not have to consult on every point. I knew what the policy was, and they had confidence in me. I was extremely lucky.
Thank you. Thanks very much. Much of the current crisis which we now see, which you briefly referred to, the crisis over Ukraine, with Putin and the mutual mistrust, probably goes back to the 1990s, even before the expansion of NATO. Could you explain to us what went wrong in Western relations with Russia in the 1990s under Yeltsin? Was it the economic relations which went wrong, or what went wrong?
The 90s for most Russians, in fact for most people in ex-Soviet states, with the exception of the 3 Baltic countries perhaps, were pretty terrible years. People have talked about Putin reversing democracy, stepping back from democracy. The 90s were not democracy. They were much more akin to anarchy. And 95% of the people had their living standards plummeted. These were very, very trying times. And from the outside, talked as if Russia was democratizing. And for Russians, the idea was, well, if that is democracy, it's not for us. As a matter of fact, they began to call it democratia. Dermo means shit in Russian. Shitocracy. So these were very difficult times, and yet we tended to get our way with Yeltsin because he was so dependent upon us. But for most Russians, they looked at that relationship as if President Clinton was simply rolling a drunk, particularly since Yeltsin often was drunk, and simply taking his time. But there were a number of things that went on that I think what hurt most was the feeling that they were being humiliated, that they were being treated overtly as if they were defeated. Now, when the Soviet Union collapsed, they had every expectation they were going to be accepted with open arms by Europe and by the United States. In fact, Yeltsin early on actually proposed a direct alliance. And we said, well, you're not quite ready for a change of scene, etc. The actions to Russians seemed, well, first of all, we've been led down a garden path. We're told, you know, you take democracy, you start threatening other people, you liberate Eastern Europe, and we're all going to be friends. In fact, it was Gorbachev's goal for a European common home. And our goal was a Europe whole and free. That was particularly during the first Bush administration. So all sorts of expectations were raised, and yet life seems to collapse. And not only that, there seemed to be no real understanding of why. Now, much of the technical aid we sent were experts in how to operate a capitalist economy who didn't know the first thing about a socialist economy or what Russia was going through. Most of their advice was totally unrealistic. And yet the idea being, you know, you've just got to get the state out of things. You privatize as quickly as possible. And you end up with what turned out to be not privatizatsiya in Russian, privatization, but prikhvatizatsiya, which means grabification. And, you know, a few dozen, really, oligarchs end up as billionaires, and then a country which largely are paupers and not even getting their pensions or their salaries at times. So this internally was a very difficult time, at a time we were praising Russia for what was supposed to be an automatic transition to democracy, as if democracy ever comes about automatically. Thank you.
We're approaching the 100th anniversary of the Russian Revolution, and since then there have been hundreds and hundreds, I imagine, of undergraduate honors theses written based on the memoirs, the published memoirs of the American and the British ambassadors to Russia back in 1917. You wrote a remarkably stunning history memoir, Autopsy on an Empire, that came out in 1995. With the benefit of hindsight, now that 20 years have passed since then, can you revisit that period, and is there anything you would write differently or say differently? And the British ambassador had the benefit of reading your account before he published his years later, and I wondered to what extent the two of you agree or disagree.
Yes, Robert Braithwaite and I think, agree on most things. In fact, we were together in Berlin just last weekend. You know, one can always look back and say, you know, maybe this or that could be different. I don't know whether it would have changed things. Let me say that I think one thing we did right was insist upon the INF deployments when we did, because that gave the Soviets an incentive and Gorbachev the tools to go to zero on the intermediate range missiles. We were right at that time to, I would say, not ignore, but to explain to the peace movement, which wanted to freeze, look, we've got the same aims that you do, but what you're doing is not going to do what we want. We want to reduce the arms, not freeze them at a high level. And another thing I think we did right, and we can think of other things that we did wrong, was to take the whole human rights issue private and not hammer at them. And, you know, I have in my portfolio here a copy of a memo that Reagan wrote just before he met with Gorbachev. And one of the points he makes, and he wrote it without any staff assistance, one of the points he makes is we're too upfront about human rights. And he said, you know, if we hammer at them in public, we will get a lot of cheers from the bleachers, but it will not help those affected. In fact, it could hurt them. Now, and from that point on, we went private, and that in time it did work. But we not only went private, we put every problem in the context of cooperation. We stopped proposing, you must do this, you must do that. But everything we were looking at, we must have a goal of reducing arms. We must have a goal of discouraging conflict in third areas instead of fueling it. We must have a goal of cooperating for better protection of human rights. We must have a goal to create a better working atmosphere. Now that meant bring down the Iron Curtain, but you put it that way, and then when you define it that way, you find you are negotiating, then you talk to the other side about the common goal and how you both get there. And this worked particularly with human rights. Okay, these are some of the things I think we did right. Now, what happened later? When first President Bush was elected, and he announced he was going into a reassessment of relations with the Soviet Union. He really didn't need an assessment. He had been very much part of all of our decisions before and been a strong supporter in the Reagan administration for negotiation. But he was not trusted by the right wing of the Republican Party. Even Reagan had trouble at times managing them. And Bush had to show that somehow he was more hardcore regarding the Soviet Union. And but when he announced that, I sent 3 long cables analyzing the situation. This was in February 1989, and one of the points I made it was that the Soviet Union had in effect declared Chapter 11 bankruptcy, and was going, perestroika means, after all, reconstruction. And what's Chapter 11 bankruptcy? You restructure the business so that it's not. And it was pretty clear to me they were not going to intervene in Eastern Europe this time, and that Eastern Europe, within a few months, and it was certainly within a year or two, was going to throw off this. Therefore, I recommended that we continue the agenda we had before, but we add 2 elements to it. One was more cooperation, explicit cooperation, on what we call transnational issues. Those such as, for example, environmental degradation and so on. And the other was to begin dealing with them seriously on economic issues to help them find a way to move to a market economy. And the Bush administration actually accepted the transnational, turned down the economic, saying the only reason they want in international economic organizations is to be the spoiler. Well, I didn't think that was the case, and of course we had no summit meeting for nearly a year. Bush didn't have another meeting with Gorbachev until December. And this year of '89 was the year of the most intense transformation within the Soviet Union. It was a time where I think there at least was a chance. It was not maybe a great chance. There was an outside chance that you could guide them in a way that could have avoided some of the problems that happened later in their economic transformation. So that's one decision that I think we might have made. Well, another one which is connected with that was that when Gorbachev came to London to the the G7 meeting on economic issues, he was hoping to get a very big bailout. He needed a lot of financial assistance. And, well, I tried to guide him to make him understand that this was very unlikely, particularly since he didn't really have a plan that you could put money in. There was no pump to prime, so to speak. But he went ahead anyway, thinking that, you know, he could get some tens of billions out of the U.S. and the Western allies, something that, by the way, Thatcher, who was no longer prime minister but still very active, was very much in favor of and was campaigning on his behalf. Well, he goes to London and he's in effect turned down flat. Now, here again, I have to be of 2 minds about it, because I'm not sure anything could have been done at that point that would have made that much difference. But the whole feeling that he had, in effect, taken away the cause for a very large amount of our defense spending, therefore saved us tens of billions, and yet we were not willing to listen carefully to what he needed then, I think went down very badly, and of course he remembers it today as one of the things that was bad.
Thank you.
One of the major controversies today still is NATO. NATO expansion on the basis of Western NATO bases in the former countries of the Soviet Union, Poland, the Czech Republic, the Baltic states, and so on. And the Russians to this very day claim that the West, Bush and Baker, the Secretary of State at the time, promised
that after the breakup of the Soviet Union, NATO would not expand and no Western bases, NATO bases, would be based in the former countries of the Soviet Union. Baker has repeatedly said that was not the case. He never gave such a commitment. My question to you, did such an agreement exist, or was a verbal agreement given by Baker and others, or do the Russians just make it up?
It's a great question that a lot of people are asking, particularly since President Putin has used this in spades and very passionately saying, you know, they are lied to us, they have lied to us, they have betrayed us, they lied to us about the Soviet Union, you know, and that they were bringing it down, they lied to us about NATO, etc., etc. That's not literally true. However, the fact is, when we were negotiating German unity, definitely the impression was given that there would be no expansion of NATO to the east. Now, what we were talking about then was the territory of East Germany. And although when we were talking about it, sometimes that was not made that explicit. It was at that time also, and this has to be considered, the negotiations on German unity that occurred in 1990 came directly after the meeting of Bush and Gorbachev in Malta in early December 1989. That was the first summit meeting when Bush was president. He had met Gorbachev before, of course, at other summits, but this was his first summit. And they made some important agreements then. First of all, they agreed we're no longer enemies. And second, Gorbachev agreed that the countries of Eastern Europe had the freedom of choice and that there would be no Soviet military intervention in Eastern Europe. And in response to that, President Bush said, committed himself that we would not take advantage of the changes in Eastern Europe, meaning a Soviet retreat from Eastern Europe. And you people who were following things at the time may remember that when the Berlin Wall fell at one point, Bush said, I will not go dance on the wall. So definitely, then in the negotiations regarding German unity, what we were trying to persuade Gorbachev was it's actually in the Soviet interest if a united Germany stays in NATO. And beginning in February of '90, Baker began to use this argument, and in his first meeting when he used it, he started out by saying, you don't have to give me an immediate answer, but think about this. Assuming there is no expansion of NATO jurisdiction to the east, not 1 inch. So far, this is literally what he said. The rest is going to be paraphrased. Then he went on, don't you think it would be in your interest to have a united Germany anchored in NATO with an American military presence in Europe? Bearing in mind that if Germany leaves NATO, there's going to be no basis for American presence in Europe. We feel that, given the past, that should be useful to all Europeans, including the Soviet Union. What he didn't say is, you know, you don't want to turn Germany loose and have some future generation have them go nuclear and so on and begin to dominate Europe again. And this was a real worry of the British and many of the French, that you let Germany unite again and give it the economic powerhouse. And Gorbachev's answer was, of course, any expansion of NATO jurisdiction is unacceptable, but what you said, I understand your argument, and I'm going to give it careful consideration. And he added, I want you to understand one thing. it is no longer our policy to exclude you from Europe. Said it once was, but we recognize you can have a stabilizing influence in Europe. Okay, maybe you don't need 300,000 troops to do it. We'd like to see fewer, but we want you to stay. That was a rather interesting statement. I told Baker as we were riding in the car back to the embassy, you got him. He's got a lot of problems at home to manage this, but he's going to buy. Because it was very clear that he saw that it wasn't even in the Soviet Union interest to separate a united Germany from the controls that NATO brought about. Now, that was not the only conversation. I've seen transcripts of some that German Foreign Minister Genscher made, where he not only made that proposal, but added, and this will apply generally to Eastern Europe. My colleague, the British ambassador, tells me that his people were also giving more general assurances. Now, when it came down to the actual negotiations, it turned out that if you bring the territory of the GDR into a united Germany, you cannot exclude it from NATO jurisdiction if Germany stays in NATO. I mean, you can't leave a part of the country out. So then the compromise was that there could be no foreign bases and no nuclear weapons stationed in that part of united Germany. And that is in the treaty that has been followed. It was mentioned, by the way, by Gorbachev last weekend, because he's being accused in Russia of not nailing down legally a no expansion. And he points out, look, the Warsaw Pact still existed then. And the point is, if you don't bring the territory of the GDR totally into NATO, at the time where there is still a Soviet Union, what possible excuse do you have for bringing in the East Europeans later when the Soviet Union has broken up and Russia cannot be anything like the thing? And however, the fact is there was no formal agreement, and actually there couldn't have been, because how can you nail down that a future government in Poland or what was still Czechoslovakia was going to, it couldn't apply for membership in NATO, and how can you commit the countries of NATO not to take them? But these have to be political decisions. The decisions were made later, and I've written about this. You'll find it in English and Russian on my website, which is simply jackmatlock.com, and it says, was there a promise? And I wrote that from the American standpoint, but the point is that I try to make to Russians is that, yes, you know, frankly, what happened later was inconsistent with our positions in 1990, position of the United States and the other NATO countries. However, it was a different time. Even if it had been a treaty, one could say that the rebus sextantibus principle no longer applied, because things had changed. And the motivation was not to isolate Russia, but to meet the needs of the East Europeans. The impetus came from Eastern Europe. It wasn't the United States trying to expand NATO, but it was the East Europeans insisting that they needed the protection and the feeling that they needed assurance on the security side if they went forward with the sort of economic changes they needed to be successful. However, just to end my comment on this, if we had been able to avoid the expansion of NATO at that time and use other methods, and instead incorporated Eastern Europe by using the EU and keep it entirely economic and leaving security issues out of it, quite frankly, I think we would have been able much more easily to handle the problems in Ukraine today.
Thank you very much indeed. Maybe we have a couple of more questions and then we open it up. But we have just heard, apart from our YouTube channel, Jack Matlock's website is also good looking at.
Ambassador Matlock, in your published history memoir, you made some fascinating observations about the personalities of Mikhail Gorbachev and also Boris Yeltsin. Since your first diplomatic posting in Moscow was back in 1961, I wondered if you knew Nikita Khrushchev personally. And more importantly, and this is for personal reasons, I'm now writing a biography of Leonid Brezhnev, and I wondered if you had occasion attending the various summit meetings, if you knew Brezhnev personally, and what your thoughts are about his his personality and his talents or lack thereof, as he's often been accused of.
It's an interesting question. I knew Khrushchev sort of at a distance. In other words, I was in meetings with him. I probably shook hands with him once. I never had a one-on-one or a meeting in a small group. But we were there during his time. We heard a lot about him from other people. And as a matter of fact, I was one of the first to hear about his approval to publish Solzhenitsyn's story, One Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich, which was a very important part of the thaw period in literature and also in publicizing the prison camps. But I was there during the period when he grew hot and cold, and then later, of course, he was removed. Brezhnev, again, I never had a one-on-one. I was in many meetings with him, including summit meetings. I was able to observe him. At things like the national celebration of the October Revolution, which took place November 7th by our calendar. They would always have the Politburo, and when I was in charge of the embassy, I would go by and shake hands with him and exchange a few words. But it was not like the relationship I was able to have with Gorbachev and Yeltsin. Where it was very personal and often never quite one-on-one, but one-on-two. They would usually at least have one assistant with them in our meetings. Well, these were all really quite different people, and it's really hard to sum it up briefly. Khrushchev, he was a man who really believed communism would work and was a better thing. He has gotten, I think he was misunderstood in the West. Okay, he was crude. He shouldn't be banging his shoe on the podium and whatnot. But it came from a great feeling of almost national inferiority complex. And yet he was determined to catch up as fast as he could in the United States. And he would set these goals, and he would set goals like at one point to exceed the United States in the production of coal and steel. Hey, they did. But by then nobody cared. Transistors and other things. But he was always looking at the United States as both the model and the competitor. And he had a great feeling of vulnerability. Eisenhower, I understand, had talked with Zhukov. They were the commanders of their respective forces during World War II, and had suggested to him that we have open skies. We both legally fly over each other's country and photograph it so we'll know what's going on. Zhukov thought that was a great idea because we had rolled up all of their spies that had been around during World War II. And Eisenhower really thought when he proposed the open skies that they would accept it. But when Zhukov went back to Moscow and mentioned it to Khrushchev, he thought it was a good idea. Khrushchev said, "You idiot. They'll find out how weak we are and they'll attack us." And he wouldn't agree to that at all. And one of the things that many people didn't understand, that much of that very intense Soviet secrecy was not to cover up strength. It was to cover up weakness. because of that feeling of vulnerability. And then things like, we will bury you. You hear that almost every time people mention Khrushchev. Well, it is really a mistranslation. Because in Russian, what he was saying was, we'll attend your funeral. Our system is better than yours, we'll outlast you. He wasn't meaning that we will conquer you or we will dig your grave and push you in it. But it shows how sometimes these sayings get twisted. I know now Brezhnev, Brezhnev was a pretty affable fellow and actually not that hard to deal with. He really, I think, wanted to make a deal and so on. But the main thing with him was, be sure you treat him as totally as an equal. I know at the first of Nixon's summits with him in '72, you still had something like a triumvirate, and all three of them would speak. Later, only Brezhnev would speak when we had these meetings. But he became senile, and at a certain point, he obviously just wasn't getting it. And I was in Moscow as chargé in '81, and at that point, I remember once he was meeting somebody at the airport, and the diplomatic corps often came out for these things, and we could watch him from the side. He went out to the plane, and no, he was seeing off a chief of state, and he accompanied him out to the plane. I forget who it was. It could have been the Indian president or prime minister. And he was coming back, and the press was in sort of a bullpen beside, and they started shouting out, how did the meeting go, in Russian? And he had trouble hearing, just as I do. And he turned to Gromyko, who was by his side, and said, "Что они сказали?" And what did they say? And Gromyko said, "Скажи хорошо." So he said, "Хорошо, хорошо." Good, good. And there were jokes at that time, which were only slightly exaggerated, connected with this, that he was going out to meet Margaret Thatcher. And she comes off the plane, and he says, "Welcome, Indira Gandhi." Gromyko says, "Thatcher, Margaret Thatcher." And he says, the script says here. Anyway, it led to a lot of jokes. Then Chernenko, though, was probably the least competent. He's the one who replaced Andropov. I did meet him under rather strange circumstances, people would think. He ran the files sort of for the Politburo. He was essentially their glorified file clerk. In fact, in meetings, you would see him, if something sensitive came in, he'd get it in a folder, and he would pass it to certain members of the Politburo who would look at it, initial, and pass it back to him. He visited Washington at one point when I was director of Soviet affairs, and the Soviet embassy called and said, we have this Politburo member, he's a very good friend of the General Secretary, and he wonders if he could come and tour your code room. Can I have that again? And I explained, you see, he's responsible for the, that on our side, and we know, you've got a good system for distribution and so on. And we don't have anything automated, and he's really curious of how you do it in the State Department. And I said, well, I'll see what I can do. And he said, please explain. He's a very good friend of our General Secretary. So I called the head of our communications, and I said, I've got a strange request, and I'm sure you're going to say no. And I explained, and he said, we can shut down for 15 minutes. Sure, we'll tell you how we process it. And we can make sure there's nothing classified up. So I called the Soviet embassy and I said, well, send him over. And so Chernenko comes and is very well dressed. And actually, we went through and they showed him how we processed the things and so on. And he was very attentive, thanked us and so on. And I said, well, I was able to show the future General Secretary, we didn't know at that time, how the State Department code would work. But by the time he was General Secretary, he was no longer even a very efficient file clerk. He had SEMA and several other things, and he, of course, lasted only a fairly brief period of time. And Gorbachev was one who evolved. His views evolved. And when people ask, what was his view on this or that, I say, well, what year did you have in mind? What month? What day? You mean morning or evening? In other words, it seemed that he was changing so rapidly during those that you didn't know what to expect. Except that I would say that over the years that certainly by 91, even by 90, our President, our Secretary of State, and then increasingly, I personally could have very frank talks with him where he would say things to us that he would not say even to his own people. And I recall in January 91, when there had been an attack on the television tower in Vilnius, Lithuania, and one that he clearly did not order. And we were worried that there was going to be more violence in putting down the independence movements in the Baltic states. President Bush sent a confidential letter, 3 or 4 pages, telling him about the various cooperative things that we would have to end if the violence continued in the Baltic. And I decided I better take this in privately and discuss it with him. So I went in by myself. He met me with just his assistant Chernyayev at his side, and I translated the letter into Russian as I read it before I handed it to him. And he listened carefully, made a few notes as he went. When I finished, he said, tell me, did he say he has done these things or he's going to do these things? And I said, he said that he would have to do these things if violence continued in the Baltic. And then to my utter surprise, he said, okay, Jack, tell me, how do you read the situation here? Well, as an ambassador, I know you're only supposed to speak with instructions. Certainly, I never had any instructions from Washington how to handle that one. Okay, he's asked me, I'm going to tell him. And this was just a couple of months after he had started what we called at the time a turn to the right. He had dismissed some of the relatively liberal people like Bakatin, Minister of Interior, and put in a hardliner. He had ordered some of the military units to the Baltic area and so on. And he had named a new prime minister, Pavlov, who was really bad news in many respects. So I told him, Mr. President, I really thought I knew where you were headed. I've been explaining this to Washington, your goals, and so on. But for the last couple of months, I'm not sure anymore. And I named some of the things that I found were hard to understand and inconsistent with what I thought was going on. And, I may have talked, as I often do, much longer than I should. Could have been as much as 15 minutes. But I thought, well, he's asked me a question, I'm going to do it. He listened, occasionally made a note, and then he looked at me and he said, Jack, he was already beginning to call me by my first name, would you please explain to your president, I have not changed my views. I have not changed my goals. But this country is on the brink of a civil war. Это страна на грани гражданской войны. And as the president, I must do everything I can to avoid that. And that means I've got to tack with the wind. I won't always be headed directly where I want to get, but my goal hasn't changed. And then he added, and this was a brilliant stroke, but please tell your president, if he feels he has to take certain actions, I will understand. Whatever he does, I will keep all of my promises. And at that time, of course, it was, one of these promises was to abstain or support a resolution to allow us to start the Gulf War. So their abstention, at the very least, in the UN was very important to us. But I thought, how brilliant, you know, he gets this, could be read as threats. His predecessors would have gone up the wall saying, you know, how dare he make these threats, etc., etc. This and in other matters, we got to the point that that we could go and sometimes deal with these issues before they ever really got to be confrontational issues publicly. Now, I'm not saying that or implying that you can do that with Vladimir Putin, but it does show how different the relationship is now and how much more difficult it is when you don't have a personal relationship between your presidents, that they can talk privately or have representatives that can do so.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I think we open it to questions from the audience. Just one final question. What about Putin? Is he a cold fish?
Is he a cold fish?
Yeah, as is often portrayed.
I wouldn't say so much a cold fish, but a very calculating, able to work out with the United States and the other Western allies, all of whom played a role. If I had time, I could go through one after another in various details, until you had that understanding, which really began to occur implicitly before the meeting in Yalta. Then these movements in Eastern Europe were going to be put down probably. And that's why we need to concentrate on the other things. You know, a couple of years ago, Lech Wałęsa and I were both lecturing on the same cruise in the Baltic. And when I mentioned that I thought that Gorbachev's changes really had enabled the East Europeans to take their history in their own hands, he said, I think you're wrong, Gorbachev had nothing to do with it. And I said, well, Mr. President, why didn't you succeed in 1981? I didn't get an answer.
Thank you. Let's take someone on this. Yes, please, this gentleman here.
Regarding the expansion of NATO, thank you for answering a lot of my questions. But question number one, the transition from Bush Sr. to the Clinton administration, there was a change in policy about expanding NATO. Was it an American push, or was it really a request coming from the Eastern countries? Question number two, should NATO expansion be contained, reduced, or continue? Should there be a concession to Putin?
You're right that there was a change in administrations. This is, of course, one problem with our foreign policy. We're not supposed to change it every time we change the president. If you're really, you know, I come from a generation who thought that politics should stop at the water's edge, that you should have bipartisan support for a foreign policy. And I must say, in ending the Cold War, we had very solid bipartisan support in the things we did. And I have to compliment the leaders of the Democratic Party on that, because our problem in the Reagan administration was not with the Democrats, but with some of the right-wing Republicans. Now, regarding NATO in particular, I think that the Clinton administration started out trying to use the Partnership for Peace instead of expanding NATO. And that had great potential to help, I would say, adjust the military in these countries to a democratic country to one run by civilians. Well, even under communism, they were run by, they had civilian control. I think the Partnership for Peace was precisely designed, and it seemed to many of us that that was the way to go, the Partnership for Peace, with, and then build up, as we could, the enforcement provisions in the OSCE, your Organization of Security and Cooperation in Europe. The precise mechanism was less important than the principle that if you were going to have a Europe whole and free, you had to include Russia in the security arrangement. You exclude them, and particularly if you use a Cold War instrument to do so, even one that had been reformed, you were going to get the situation we have today. One thing, you were going to undermine the democratic forces within Russia, and second, if you kept the process to the point that there was any chance of countries like Ukraine or Georgia joining NATO, this was going to send any Russian president, no matter how democratic, up the wall.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Yes, this gentleman here.
I was a Foreign Service officer for many years and lived through a lot of these experiences you described. Shortly after President Reagan left office, I accompanied another official to see him in California and have a conversation. And in that conversation, we talked about the things you've talked about. And he got off on the question of, well, when did Gorbachev realize things had to change? And he said, of course, a lot of people think it was the military buildup that we initiated with my administration. But that wasn't it. What was it was Gorbachev's first visit to the United States. And he said when he saw what we are as a country and an economy, he realized the game was over. And that the Soviet Union had to embark on a completely new path. I'm curious as to whether you find that consistent with your appreciation and how you see the relative influence of political versus economic affairs in foreign policy.
Again, this is an excellent question that one could talk about a long time. I think that when it comes to the general reforms, he came to office as General Secretary convinced that the country had to change. He wasn't, as he puts it now, and apparently did then privately, he says that he and Shevardnadze, whom he brought up to Moscow as foreign minister, they had often, as when they met, in South Russia and the Caucasus, they would say, when they were in private, we can't go on like this. They realized that the country was not delivering what it should, but he wasn't sure how to do it. And when he first became General Secretary, I think he really thought he could lead the Communist Party to make these reforms. But, the first changes they made, like the anti-alcohol campaign and one that they called Uskarienia, which was speeding up, in other words, work harder, just didn't work. They were both complete failures. And then the economy kept underperforming, shall I say. It wasn't yet collapsing. But the thing is, it seemed that the military was taking up more and more. And that's why I think he needed to be convinced, but it was probably prepared to be convinced, that if there was no threat, they had to reduce the military. And so it was partly economic, it was partly military, but both he and Ryzhkov who was the then prime minister, recognized they were putting much too much into the military. And by early '87, we know from Chernyayev's Politburo notes, which have been published, that he was telling the military, you've robbed our people, you've built up more than we need. In fact, in April, February, just after he met with Margaret Thatcher, who really let him have it, he started out by saying they don't call her an Iron Lady for nothing, and that I hoped I held my own in our debates. But then he said, but comrades, you know, one point she's got a point. We have built up so much arms, they're afraid of us. And then he said, and this was something that we had encouraged him to believe, he said, their military-industrial complex wants to trap us in an arms race which they know we will lose. Comrades, we can't let them do that to us. We have got to cut our military, and we have to cut it unilaterally. Now, you know, this one of Reagan's goals in his first meeting with Gorbachev, and he said this in this memo that I mentioned before, he said, I must convince Gorbachev that we don't want an arms race, but if they insist upon one, they're going to lose it. And this was the whole point of his build-up. It was not to use the arms. It was to have arms. It's to convince the Soviet Union we need to build them down. So a combination of these things, plus, I would say, the facts, that we could simply use the facts. Schultz would use the economic argument, for example. And as long as we put that in the context of we both need to cut arms. Okay, in this category, maybe you need to cut more because you built more, but we want to come down to equal levels. And I'd also add that one of the things from early on in the Reagan administration, when we were developing our negotiating strategy, Reagan insisted that we not seek military superiority. He wanted something that was negotiable. And he said that won't work, they won't accept it, and it would be unstable. So we were not seeking superiority. Now we would argue about what was equal, but I would say there were both economic and military things, and things were changing. You know, the Soviet Union, things were changing, you know, everywhere, sort of simultaneously. And meanwhile, as opposition developed in the party, he began to see that he had to do it without the party, and that's when he began to take the party out of total control of things.
Yeah, thank you very much. The lady over there? Yeah, Mr. Shaw, yeah.
Yes. I would love to know whether...
Speak up.
You can't hear me? Okay. I would love to know whether you think there are any general lessons that we can learn from your experience of negotiating the end of the Cold War for other conflicts that today might look intractable. So I'm, for example, thinking about the nuclear negotiations with Iran.
Are there any lessons we can learn from the end of the Cold War and the negotiations, for example, regarding the negotiations with Iran?
Are there any lessons we can learn from the end of the Cold War? Yes, I think so. I think the most basic lesson, and it started with the Reagan administration and continued with the first Bush administration, is we talk to everybody and we talk to them even if they're crises. Now, one of the big fights we had in Washington, often among, I would say, Reagan's more conservative, as he would put it, supporters, was every time there was a crisis, they wanted to break off talks. Reagan said, we don't walk away from tables. They may, but we don't. We will stay in communication. I think that, quite honestly, although the whole Iran-Contra, getting back to Iran, involved a very serious mistake in the diversion of funds for the Contras. Nevertheless, what they were trying to do was exactly what we should have done, and that is enter into a dialogue with the Iranians and seemed to me that if one of the ways to do that was supplying some defensive weapons when they were in a war which Iraq had started, that was an opportunity for us. It's too bad that was mishandled, I think, both by the people involved, but particularly by the way it was received. And the whole Iran-Contra made Iran the sort of the third rail of diplomacy, and we received repeatedly various probes after that from the moderate forces, and there are moderate forces in Iran, and particularly around 2003, before we attacked Iraq, was an ideal time to engage Iran broadly, not just say we'll only do it on the nuclear issue. Because the fact is that on most issues, our interests and theirs are similar. And I would say the only one that really you can't compromise on is Israel. But most of the other issues, we should be able to find some common ground. So I think that has been a big mistake. I think also, even in dealing in the Middle East, I think we should have maybe not had official, but we should have stayed in communication with organizations like Hamas and others, which have elements that deal in terrorism. But it's one thing to say we won't pay for hostages, we won't give in to terrorism, but you need to be in communication with groups that may be guilty of it upon occasion, among other things, in order to find out how to deter them. So that I think the lack of dialogue, which seems to be the preference of some, with some countries like Iran, is a great contrast and shows that we didn't learn some of the things we could have.
Thank you. Yes, please, the lady over there. Yeah.
You just came back from Berlin, and I just wondering if you was witnessing nationalistic movement in Berlin, Nazistic movement in Berlin. And it's same like in Ukraine now. It's they make national hero like Bandera, and a lot of Nazistic movement in Ukraine right now. Did you witness this or not?
Did you witness any right-wing movements in Berlin when you were recently in Berlin, similar to some right-wing movements which you can observe in Ukraine?
In the right-wing movements in Berlin, they were certainly not in evidence around the Brandenburg Gate, where the celebrations were held, the ones that I witnessed. I don't think there's a big problem in Germany with what one might call, it may be unfairly, the neo-fascists. There are problems, I think, with the extreme right wing in Hungary and probably in western Ukraine. But I don't think this is a significant force in Germany.
Okay, thank you. We've got a few more minutes for a few more questions with the gentleman here.
Thanks for your fascinating insights tonight. I've always been fascinated by the Reykjavik summit meeting, and where my recollection was that Reagan may have given up more than some in the administration wanted him to give up in his discussions at that summit meeting. Do you have anything to recollect regarding that meeting?
Well, you know, again, this is something that would take a long time to go through all the ramifications. I actually have 2 chapters in my book, Reagan and Gorbachev, on Reykjavik. One on what happened and the next on why it wouldn't have worked and what might have.
Reykjavik was that summit where Gorbachev and Reagan almost agreed to abolish all nuclear weapons, but in the end it failed because of SDI, wasn't it?
Well, not only SDI. Again, it's awfully hard to be simple about something this complex. Reykjavik was where we came very close to an agreement that would have resulted in the elimination of nuclear weapons, and if the American proposal had been accepted, ballistic missiles, whether nuclear or not, at the end of 10 years. Reagan was basically a nuclear abolitionist, and so was Gorbachev. Almost nobody on the staff of either country agreed with them on that. But they did. But Gorbachev wanted to limit research on the Strategic Defense Initiative to 10 years, which he thought would kill it. It probably wouldn't have. And Reagan felt he had a promise to the American people to conduct this research effort and to find out if you could have defenses against strategic weapons. I should explain that he was horrified by what they call MAD, mutual assured destruction. When he was told that the only defense we have against a nuclear strike is to counterstrike, he simply said, that's unacceptable. You're expecting me to kill millions of innocent people to protect the American people? I think he knew he couldn't do that. And that's why he wanted to find, if defenses were possible. Now, we had discussed this with Gorbachev off and on, including in correspondence before Reykjavik. And before Reykjavik, he had proposed to Gorbachev that if you're worried about one side deploying defenses, when they still have weapons that can be used against the other side. In other words, if one side has defenses, the other side doesn't, that we will agree two things. One thing, we would agree if we find it works, we'll share it. I mean, it's a defensive system. And second is, if you're worried about that, we will agree that there would be no deployment of defenses until both of us have destroyed all of our ballistic missiles. Now, that proposal Gorbachev never took seriously, so it was not only Reagan's turning down the 10 years in laboratories, but it was also a matter of Gorbachev not taking seriously either. I mean, when Reagan talked about sharing, Gorbachev said, well, you don't even share automated milking machines with me. How do you expect me to think we would share them? And we got back to Washington after that, and my first task was to write a memo how we follow on, and what in fact we would need to negotiate or do to bring us to a point that we could eliminate nuclear weapons in 10 years. And Poindexter told me that, you know, we can certainly accept 8 years in laboratories, maybe even 10. And others were saying, look, we can accept his proposal. And yet it was clear that more was going to have to happen for it to be possible to eliminate than just arms control. There had to be some political changes. And I developed a game plan for these, which went to John Poindexter the day before he resigned over Iran-Contra. Iran-Contra took out of the administration almost everybody who had dealt on this, and the president was so weakened by it, we could never go back with our counter-proposals. If we had, we probably at least could have gotten a START agreement by the following year in '88. It didn't happen.
Thank you. That's very interesting. We have got time for 2 or 3 questions, and then we have to finish. The gentleman in the red T-shirt there.
I may be an old guy with a bald head, but I spent about half my life on the internet. You said early in your talk that Putin was able to control the media. How? What is the status of the internet in Russia? Does the average person on the street have the world access to all the news outlets of all political persuasions, or is it quite limited?
Questions about the internet. You mentioned that Putin has control of the media. He said he spends half of his time on the internet. To what extent do people there have access to news apart from the media?
Oh, yes, of course. As yet, the people do have access to the internet, and the Putin government has not interfered nearly to the degree the Chinese have for internet access, although they have begun to interfere with some. But the point is that most Russians, they get their news from television. And yes, they do use the internet, but the pro-Putin forces also are deployed very strategically throughout the internet. I mean, I have a Facebook page, and I have both Russian and well, everybody else, the nationality there, but they're pro-Putin apologists who will come at you, and almost everything that is said, if they find it is critical. Often this is on the basis of Russian patriotism, and it often reflects this profound feeling that you have insulted us. You have insulted us. And therefore they come back with such things as, well, the United States simply overthrows government after government after government, and you are now trying to impose Nazis on Ukraine, and that should be ours, and lay off, you know. So even on the internet, that voice is there. I'm sure many of them are paid to do this, but yes, you can still get a full discussion on the internet. But most Russians are going to be influenced, the massive Russians, by what they see on television, and they do control the television.
Thank you. I think we will get lots of friend requests after this. We have time for one more question. Just a note to what you just said. You know, the Voice of America had a Russian channel, or they had a channel broadcasting on a Russian channel their own program for a few hours a day, and over a week actually. It was a weekly program, and they recently got asked after only 3 or 4 shows to really stop it. You know, it was too sensitive for the Russian public, I believe. The gentleman in the blue t-shirt.
What will be required to stop NATO expansion? Without detracting from the originality of your arguments, among Kennan's last published remarks, he made the same arguments. We've known for over 20 years that NATO expansion would prod the beast. Then, in 2007, we saw this whole movie. Plainly, the Georgians were encouraged by the US to become more involved in South Ossetia, and the Russians responded. Then in this year, we make the same sort of advances in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, in which Russian interests are far greater. The consequences seem natural, and yet the rhetoric coming out of the US foreign policy elite and the US media seems to be that we must continue with this brave effort to advance freedom. What's it going to take to stop this insanity?
You're probably better able to answer that than I am. I'm puzzled by it. What strikes me, and this may be overgeneralization, a little unfair, is how, in effect, the neocon thinking, which the Reagan administration was able to keep under control, and which never really affected the first Bush, seemed to become dominant in the Bush-Cheney administration, and as far as Russia is concerned, to continue to a great extent in the current Obama administration. In the Obama administration, it is really based upon I think a desire which is genuine but quite naive to protect human rights and to spread democracy. And what people don't realize is that attempts abroad to spread democracy by promoting demonstrations, by promoting opposition to the current government, is going to be viewed there precisely the way we reviewed communists during the Cold War, as trying to create a fifth column. And second, on human rights, these are genuine issues, but you start trying to deal with them publicly, humiliating other people, as such things as the Magnitsky Act, which was passed by the U.S. Congress when they couldn't even pass a budget for their own government. I mean, this is the essence of arrogance. And, you know, even when the rights that they are pushing for should be protected, that's not the way to do it. And, you know, given the Russian attitude toward the United States and the fact that they feel they've been treated as a defeated country, any overt attempt to directly protect human rights within Russia actually acts against the people involved. And it does more harm than good. This, again, that's the reason I mentioned earlier Reagan's insight on this. You don't do it publicly. We have been doing it not only publicly, but even legislatively in an outrageous way.
Thank you. One last question. If Obama was on the phone to you tomorrow and said, "Hey Jack, I need some good advice. What am I going to do about Russia and Putin? How can I settle it so that we can go back to having friendly relations, cooperative friendly relations, like with many other countries in the world? Jack, what am I going to do?"
Well, first of all, I don't think he wants my advice. He told David Remnick in his interview for the New Yorker, and I don't know what he meant by this, I don't need a George Kennan. Now, I'm not comparing myself to Kennan, except that I read that to mean he doesn't need any outside advice. If I were to give him advice, and there's no point in giving it if he doesn't want it, it would be, and I actually have written this publicly, keep our voice down, try to stay out. First of all, let the Europeans deal with Ukraine. It's a European issue. The more involved we get, the more difficult it becomes for them to solve it. And the second thing is on human rights. At this point, we got to shut up as far as Russia is concerned. Our overt support to forces that are trying to remove Putin simply makes them seem like traitors. And you know, we've got to play it cooler than that. So I would suggest that he, and I think frankly, recently he has kept his voice down. I think he has at least taken some of this implicit advice. The only other thing would be to try to have, in some way, a real heart-to-heart with Putin. And in that, he's got to give him certain assurances. We're really not going to push for Ukraine and NATO, and that he would at least instruct Secretary of State Kerry to impress upon Poroshenko, the Ukrainian leader, that for his future he has got to make a deal with Russia. There's no way Ukraine is going to be able to live a halfway normal life if they're in a hostile position to Russia. You know, they have to learn what the Finns taught themselves. That is, how to be independent, but at the same time not provocative. And, you know, if he sees that we are really genuine in that, you might find a way to begin to ease things off. But so much has gone on publicly, this is going to be difficult, and I don't expect him or Putin to publicly back down on something they've said before. They can't do that politically. And that's the problem of getting, you know, so publicly at odds. But nevertheless, it shouldn't be thought impossible. And maybe now that he doesn't have to cater to what seems to have been a totally impotent Democratic Senate. Maybe he can be more independent if he chooses to.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm sure the White House will listen to that. Let me thank you, Ambassador Matlock, for a great performance, a great talk, and a great Q&A session. Thank you very much for coming here, and thank you for coming too. Before you all rush away, can I just point out to you, we have a talk on the 20th of November, next Thursday, about the end of the Cold War, Reagan, Gorbachev, and the end of the Cold War, by Professor H.W. Brands from Texas University in Austin, in 569, Hamilton 569, at 4 p.m. next Thursday. And for next semester we have various good scholars and various ambassadors and other distinguished statesmen assembled. So please come back next semester. Thank you very much.